Hey everyone, welcome back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. So the topic for today is Bobby Hutcherson's Medina. So this is the latest Tone Poet edition that just came out last Friday along with Lee Morgan's Taru. So actually earlier this week, put together a bit of a review video of that title. So go check that out after this one. But yeah, we're going to dive into Medina. So as always, before we get started, hit like, hit subscribe. You can follow me on Instagram at what_can_brown, and yeah, let's dive in. All right, so real quick, I just want to bump one quick thing before we get into Medina. So a couple of videos ago, I talked about how Resonance Records had discounted their 10-disc Nat King Cole box set down to like, I think it was like $69.99 on their website, and there's a coupon code that's just 10 off. I just wanted to bump that because I know that there was a lot of people that were excited about it, and I just wanted to remind you that that promotion over on their website is going through the end of August, and actually that 10 off coupon can be used for any title. It's just that it's really nice to use a coupon when the item's also on sale. So I wanted to reference that. So yeah, let's talk about Medina. So there's a lot to say, but what we usually do is we talk about the history, we talk about the music, maybe the lineup and how it sounds. So let's try that. So first, let me just say about Medina. So the lineup here includes, and I love all Bobby Hutcherson's albums, let's be real, but the lineup here includes some of my absolute favorite Hutcherson collaborators. And so who do we have? We have Harold Land, we have Reggie Johnson, we have Joe Chambers, as well as Stanley Cowell. And I guess the interesting thing here is that I feel like when I say some of my favorite Hutcherson collaborators, that kind of implies that they collaborate often. Not so much with Cowell, and that's not to say he wasn't, I guess, a frequent collaborator, I suppose, in terms of some of the live performances. But as far as studio albums, I want to say that maybe the only other album that they did together was Bobby Hutcherson's Now. It's just called Now! I may be wrong. I'm gonna have to go and double check that. But yeah, I mean, it's great to hear him here. I also wanted to reference Reggie Johnson, maybe specifically, because I think if you've heard of any of these musicians, you've probably heard of, well, Hutcherson and Harold Land, but Reggie Johnson, perhaps not as much, right? So it feels to me like he was really important in the development of Hutcherson's sound during this time period. But maybe he wasn't as big of a name as perhaps some of the other musicians on this album. Meanwhile, Reggie Johnson had some really impressive credentials with some like really innovative musicians. I don't know that he was necessarily doing a lot as a leader at this time period, but he was playing with Albert Ayler and Marion Brown, Giuseppe Logan, Valdo Williams. He also played on Hutcherson's Total Eclipse, Head On, and Spiral. But the point that I want to make is that he was, not only was he on the scene and playing with a lot of people, but he was playing a lot of like innovative music with a lot of just innovative musicians. And so I wanted to call him out in particular. All right, so as far as the history of Medina, this is an interesting one, and it actually has something in common with Taru, with Lee Morgan's Taru, that came out again on the same day. So both of these albums first saw the light of day in Blue Note's LT series in 1980, and Medina hadn't had a single vinyl reissue until now. The cover on this, so the cover choice that they used here, this is actually a mirror image of the cover that was used for the 1998 CD release, which is actually a little strange because I mentioned it's a mirror image, so like why would they flip it? Or maybe it was flipped for the CD and they corrected it for this. And incidentally, that particular CD release, yes, it was called Medina, but it actually combined tracks from Medina as well as those from the album Spiral. So both of those albums were actually recorded in sort of the fall or winter of 1968, and they actually both have the same lineup. So combining the two, I suppose, in the CD format that actually allows for that, I guess they can do that. Maybe the question that you're going to ask, though, is, well, now we have Medina, when are we going to get Spiral? But let's focus on this, right? Like, because we can't immediately go to what's next. Let's talk about what's here, and obviously we'll cross our fingers for Spiral at some point. All right, so I think when I covered Taru the other day, I think I mentioned something about the fact that, obviously it was a shelf session, and maybe I got into. I'm trying to remember if I touched on any of the other shelf sessions of Lee Morgan's. Lee Morgan had a number of shelf sessions from this time period, but not as many, I don't think, as Bobby Hutcherson. I'd have to go in and like tally them up. Basically, this time period for Hutcherson yielded just a lot of unreleased studio sessions for Blue Note, and not many that people actually heard at the time, or even close to the time. So I don't know why this was the case, but consider this. So Stick Up, right, was an album that probably some of you are aware of, and it was put out in the Tone Poet series. Stick Up was recorded in 1966, but shelved for about 2 years, released in 1968. That's not that unusual. For Blue Note, they often would, have a session and then it wouldn't be released, say, within months or even necessarily a year. It might take 2 years. But following Stick Up was Oblique. So that was in 1967. It was shelved until 1979. Incidentally, also an excellent title in the Tone Poet series. The next one was Patterns. That one was recorded in 1968 and shelved until 1980. Patterns was included in the Blue Note Review box set, which is kind of like a precursor to Tone Poet. So then came Total Eclipse, and that one was released fairly soon after its recording. But then, following that was Spiral, recorded mostly in mostly in 1968, and then shelved until 1979. And then there was Medina, again recorded in 68 and shelved until 1980. So you'd almost think that Blue Note was like about to drop Hutcherson or something, but instead, after this period of time where it felt like they didn't really appreciate his work as much, or at least it didn't translate into albums that were actually released. It could have been for any of a variety of reasons, I don't know. But instead, he followed that sort of 1966 to 1968 problematic time period with 12 more albums between 1970 and 1977 for Blue Note that got basically immediate releases. So, the irony, though, is that Hutcherson left Blue Note in 1977, and I think he went to Columbia. Blue Note starts releasing those shelf sessions just 2 years later. So they wait for him to leave, and then like immediately they're just like, all right, let's like start putting him out in the LT series. Incidentally, every single one of those shelf sessions is worth hearing, and certainly Medina is no exception. So let's talk about Medina now. So in contrast to Lee Morgan's Taru, which I just reviewed again the other day, and I said one of the things that I alluded to at least was that it was relatively commercial, but that it still had a lot of interesting stuff. This album, by contrast, much more complex, not at all commercial, at least in terms of it yielding, say, like short, catchy tracks that maybe you'd expect to hear on the radio. That's not what this is, and I think that if you're a fan of Bobby Hutcherson during this time period, you probably know that. So what this is very much what you'd expect, again, from Hutcherson's playing in the mid to late 60s. It's sort of sprawling, a lot of like sort of post-bop, extended solos, less formal structure, much more improvisational. Some of the credit here and on some of these other albums for this style is not necessarily purely Bobby Hutcherson, but also Joe Chambers. He was just a critical part of Bobby Hutcherson's group. He contributed a lot of compositions, and this album is no exception. In fact, two of my favorite compositions, which actually take up the entire side two, are both Joe Chambers's. But a couple of comments, I guess, about each of these tracks. So let's start from the beginning. So Avis is the opening track on side one. This one actually is a Hutcherson original, and because it's something to do with the composition. I think it's so like because the chord progression on this tune doesn't resolve. It has this kind of vibe of like uncertainty. That was a pun. Uncertainty and sort of like intensity. Just by the nature of the structure of the song. So when you hear it, I think you'll know what I'm saying, even if what I said just now doesn't make sense to you. I would say that this piece is somewhat characterized, or sort of a highlight of it is the doubled melody line by Harold Land and Bobby Hutcherson, which I find it's always amazing that they could play at the same rapid speed with such precision, given that they're like completely different instruments. But they were just so in tune, it felt like. Harold Land's best moment, I think, on this album for me is on this track during his solo. He has this really like throaty tone that works really well with the style of the music, and again, I think against the rhythm section's backing. I'm going to get into to his tone, I think, a little bit more when I talk about sort of the sonic elements, or like how good the album sounds, but I'll do that later. Hutcherson also sounds at the top of his game here, and I really like the moments on Avis where the bass and the drums play like double time at various points. So during Bobby Hutcherson's solo, there's these like the rhythm section goes to double time, and what I mean by that is when they play like twice as fast, basically they double the tempo, even though Hutcherson continues to play at the same tempo. So effectively, it's not that the piece is speeding up, but it creates the sense of things speeding up and increased intensity. So it's like it's a device that's used by a variety of musicians, and I think it works really well here. Track 2 is Comes Spring. So that's the next one. It's a pretty slow, sort of contemplative piece at least up front, before the tempo picks up. Harold Land leads a kind of explorative solo that's really nice here. And I think it's a highlight. Dave's Chant is track 3. It's another one that highlights Land really well. I mean, all these pieces highlight Hutcherson, I think, really well because of how great he is at establishing like tone and like playing very texturally. But in some ways, Harold Land is just is front and center on a lot of these, and that's not a bad thing. Like all of these are ensemble pieces, but I think that those that highlight Land, it just sounds amazing, and like this is some of his best playing. It really is. I think he gels with the group so well here. So generally speaking, though, if I was going to say, and I know I'm skipping over kind of the last one. One of the things that I wanted to say, though, about this album in terms of the differences between side 1 and 2, not only is side 1 shorter pieces, there's 4 of them, versus side 2, there's 2. Side 1 is a little bit more of individual artists who are highlighted in some ways. Whereas, and it's not that they don't stand out on side 2, I just feel like the side 2 pieces are even more ensemble focused. And again, those are the ones that are by Joe Chambers, that are sort of more sprawling, kind of modal pieces. All right, so let's address those two on side 2, because again, I think they're highlights of what's just a really strong album overall anyway. So the title track, Medina, is the first one on side 2. Definitely a modal feel here. So not what I mean by that is not an overt or sort of discernible chord progression. So on this track, there's a repeating bass line, or at least mostly with some variation, because he's not just going to play the same thing on repeat. Meanwhile, Joe Chambers sticking mostly to cymbals with some snare fills that create a really nice texture here, I think. Harold Land, again, I can't get past Harold Land on this album. He sounds amazing on this track, and without the chord constraints, feels like he's able to get even more creative with his solo. And one thing I want to bring up is that, because I know that some folks get nervous when they hear things like, creativity, or when I say like lack of chord progression. This album is not atonal. Like the musicians are not playing atonally. And throughout the album, there is a consistent beat on the individual tracks. So you don't have to worry about this getting, like, say, too experimental. It's not free jazz. I wanted to be clear, because I personally think that even though when I started listening to jazz, I didn't start with post bop, I started more with swing and then moved into hard bop, and like post bop was even after that. I think that progression is a journey that most people can take, and I understand that there's certain styles of music that can get more challenging. But I think that post bop is if it sounds challenging to you up front, then I still think that it's very much worth leaning into and trying to get more into. And I think that this is a great example because it's so beautiful. So on Medina, when Hutcherson comes in, his solo starts with him playing with like rhythmic patterns. So listen to that, because he's basically playing the same note repeatedly, but he's playing with rhythm for a little bit. And I think it's a really great complement with Chambers' drums. And it's clear that immediately those two are like feeding off of each other, probably because Hutcherson's sort of like, playing for for Chambers and essentially taking over some of his responsibilities in terms of playing with rhythm. So Medina, anyway, is just a sprawling, beautiful piece. You got to listen to it. The final track is called Ungano. This one has a really nice melody line, and not many of these tracks have a heavy focus on melody, but I really like the melody line on this one. Very optimistic in feel, I think, because of the I guess it would be like the key that it's in or the choice of notes. Reggie Johnson's bass on this track is really present and really nice, adds a lot of warmth to the track. This one actually does have a chord progression, but the chord choices still allow for the musicians to go basically wherever they want and always hit a correct note, if that makes sense. It's kind of what I mean earlier when I said atonal, right? Sometimes the chord progression dictates the choice of notes that a musician could play in order for them to sound in key or like in tune, well, in key. But there is one of the sort of tools in the tool bag for a musician or somebody who's composing a track or a piece is to choose chord progressions that allow a lot of freedom with the soloists, and this definitely does that here as well. So those are the tracks, and I here's the thing: it's always hard for me to express what songs sound like. So I'd encourage everyone to go and preview this, obviously. I always encourage people to do that. But what I want to close with now is basically how this album sounds. And I can definitely say that it sounds excellent. So that's the top line sort of message. If we set aside like the actual music that's being played, which I know is hard to do, but if we were just going to talk about what instruments sound the best, I'd say the highlight for me is Harold Land. So I mentioned earlier about his tone. He has this rasp to his tone that gives his horn gives his playing a lot of character, and it's really nice to hear it in this kind of like audiophile format. I just feel like his tone is so well represented here, and if anything, it has more of an organic quality because it's a saxophone for me than the vibraphone, and therefore it feels like to me that there's some additional detail that you can kind of hear from the horn versus what you can get generally from the vibes. So anyway, maybe that's why I said it how I did. All the musicians here, though, do sound great. There's not a single one who I think is shortchanged. I really love how Chambers' cymbals sound against Hutcherson's vibes, and obviously you're going to get a lot of that here. I just think the two layered is a really nice effect with the stereo kind of separation. It's really nice. I know I said Land, especially as a musician, that I liked, but really I just got the sense that this is like some of the best that each of these musicians have sounded. And I think I mean that not only in terms of the sonic detail, but also their playing. This is just a really, really inspired album. It's post-bop is one of my favorite styles to hear. And I know that some people don't like these labels, but I'm trying to leverage some of these descriptors so that you know what to expect. And I think that, and obviously these are some of my favorite musicians, so what's not to love? Incidentally, I had the opportunity to play with Hutcherson when I was in college. He sat in on our concert one night, and I don't know, I've just been a huge fan of his ever since. So anytime that the folks at Blue Note and the Tone Poet series, so I mean Joe Harley and Kevin Gray and come together and put out some of this great music, I just I think it's fantastic. Like Hutcherson releases are always the highlights for me, along with Lee Morgan, of the Tone Poet series. So whenever those are in the calendar, I just get super excited. And the fact that we both had them on the same day, coming from unreleased shelf sessions, I think it's fantastic. All right, so that's pretty much it. Normally I talk about the cover up front, and I talked a little bit about the cover up front. But one thing I neglected was I wanted to just mention really quick, because I know some people point this type of stuff out. This is not a gatefold, whereas Taru was, right? So as far as I understand, and I probably don't understand that far, they use a gatefold. Obviously not all the time. For Blue Note, they typically do use a gatefold. My understanding, however, is if there aren't session photos, then they don't really have the ability to fill the, the interior of a gatefold. So I'm just guessing. I don't know. But the fact that we've only really just seen this photo on the CD release as well as now on this, and otherwise the LT series cover was atrocious and didn't include any session photos, it's possible we don't have session photos, and that's the reason why they didn't choose a gatefold. But either way, this is obviously not the only Tone Poet title that doesn't use a gatefold, so it's not that big of a deal. You still get great liner notes on the back. And yeah, I just wanted to mention that though, because I know a lot of people kind of focus in on this stuff. So with that, I think that's all I wanted to talk about. But I was really excited to be able to listen to these albums and talk about them for you in this format because I was just really looking forward to it, and I've been listening to this one especially a lot over the last few days. So highly recommend it. Go check it out. Go preview it. And I guess I'll leave you with that. So thanks very much. I'll see you next time.